This video covers the content of the SAP Cloud Platform Workflow Virtual Event, content which is available on GitHub, and specifically it covers exercise 7, which is all about calling the workflow API from Postman. So in this exercise, we're going to do something similar to the previous exercise, i.e. call workflow APIs, but not from the API hub. This time around, we're going to use this third-party API client called Postman. So in this exercise, there's a number of steps where we'll open Postman up and import a workflow collection, which is basically a collection of API calls that are predefined for us. We're going to create a new Postman environment to point to our specific instance of the workflow service. We're going to select that environment for use. We're going to set up authentication from an OAuth 2.0 perspective for the request that's in the collection. We're going to have a quick look at the rest of the request's details. And then finally, we're going to make the request and then have a look at the results using the Fiori Launchpad, using the Monitor Workflow Instances tile. So let's get started. I've already opened up Postman, and the first thing to do is to import the workflow collection. Now, we can define workflows manually here, but just for the sake of speed, there's a workflow collection in this repo, and we can see that here it's defined as JSON. And we can import that by using the URL in the import facility in Postman. So I'm just going to specify that URL here in the link. And we can see that it's recognized the collection. And in this particular case, the collection has one subfolder with just one API call in it, which is fine, which is exactly what we want. Notice that we can already recognize, if we remember from the previous exercise, that this is being a post request to /v1/workflow instances. This is an API call to start a new workflow instance from a given definition. Notice also, though, in the URL, we've got some variables, and this variable at the moment is shown in red, denoting that it's unresolved. So it's not defined in any particular active collection, environment, or in any global variables. So it's at this stage in step 2 of the exercise that we create a so-called Postman environment, which is similar to environments in the API hub. So a Postman environment allows us to define specific values for properties relating to, for example, in our case, our workflow service instance. So the first thing we want to do is to create an environment, and let's call it, as it says here, my workflow environment. Now over on the top right, we've got inside this cog here, manage environments. We can create a new environment and we'll give it a name. And again, following the same approach as in the previous exercise, we need to specify in this environment information relating to OAuth 2.0 authentication. And we need information from the service key from the workflow service instance. I've already got open here via my trial subaccount home bookmark. I've jumped straight to the service key. I'm going to make that a little bit bigger so we can see it. And let's just go through now and add these 4 variables here in the environment with values from the service key, just like we did in the previous exercise. Now, I personally like to use the sort of the node identifier inside of the service key data itself as the variable name, because that helps me remember what it is. So I'm going to specify for this first variable endpoints.workflow rest URL, and the value for that, of course, just like last time, is there. So I'm going to specify that in the current value. The next thing we need is the client ID from within the UAA node, so UAA client ID. So I'll create a new variable and specify this as the value. And we need the client secret as well. So there's a client secret variable name, and the client secret is down here. And finally, again, just like last time, we need the URL, the root URL of the endpoint for OAuth 2 token requests. Okay, so we've now got an environment, so that's great. we haven't yet set that environment for use, and that's clear because this variable is still unresolved. So now what we need to do is just to go over here and select the My Workflow Environment name from the list, and immediately the color of this variable changes and we can see that it's resolvable, and we can see the actual current value there, which is great. Now, as we know already, CF Workflow APIs are protected with OAuth 2, and just as the API hub handles that for us via the client credentials flow, Postman can do that for us as well. So as it says here, we can take the variable values we specified, i.e. the client ID and the client secret, for example, and use them in Postman's OAuth 2 handling. So we can switch to the authorization tab, and we can see in this tab that there's different types of authentication that we can choose. OAuth 2.0 was the type that was pre-selected, which is great. And we can now use the get new access token to specify details for an access token. And as we can see in here, we're also, from the imported workflow collection, this is where these variables are defined here, we can use the values of the URL, the token endpoint route, the client ID and the client secret to make that request to go and get an access token. Okay, so we've already got pre-filled the appropriate values for all these different variables here. So we've got the token name, we've got the grant type here. Client credentials is what we want from an OAuth perspective. And when we use client credentials, we need an access token endpoint with, that's the URL, root plus /OAuth /token. We have a client ID and client secret to authenticate against that request. And we also have a choice of sending. How do we want to send the client authentication once we've got it? And we're going to send it in a basic authorization header. That's sending the token that we've retrieved in the header of the actual request to the API endpoint. The alternative is to send the client credentials in the body, but we want to send it as the authorization header with the bearer prefix. Okay, so now we're going to request token. And we can see that Postman has made that call to the OAuth token endpoint to ask for a token, and it's saved a token, which is here, in a token called my token, which we specified. Okay, so we can either now say, well, just use this token, which we'll do now, or we can actually select the token from here. So now we have a token. That token is just stretched out onto one line there, and we can see the header prefix that's going to be used in the authorization header when we make the call to the V1 workflow instances endpoint. Now, before we continue and before we try and make the call, we can now look at the rest of the request's details. So if we have a look, for example, in the body tab here, all this at the top here in Postman, these are all the details of the HTTP call that we're going to make. So we can see the body here, which is again very similar to the body of the request that we made to the V1 workflow instances endpoint in a post context. So we're specifying the order process definition ID, workflow definition ID, and we're specifying some data in the context as well. Okay, so now, as it says here in step 6, it's now finally time to make the request. So we're going to send that request with the send button and examine the response. And we can see that the request completed successfully. We've got a 201 created status code, which is exactly what we're expecting. And we've also got in the body of the response the details of the workflow instance that we've just created. So finally, as the last step in this exercise, we're going to go over to the Fiori Launchpad and to have a look in the Monitor Workflows Workflow Instances app to make sure we can see the workflow instance that we've just created. And the details of the request were we've requested this HT1003 product, so we can look out for that. So let's go and open the Fiori Launchpad. We can jump to the details of our dev space to go directly to the FLP site. So here's the site that we've been using in previous exercises. We can look at the monitor workflow instances app, and of course we need to specify, we need to expand the list of possible statuses so we can see the one we've just created because it's already complete. And this is the one here. So this is an order for HT1003, which is exactly what we've just ordered, and that's today, just now, 0705. So that's great. We can see that this has been created via the Workflow API from Postman. Thanks for watching.